Gaurav Margaret, Last Concordia. Firstly, I just want to, on behalf of the Social Democrats, give our support for this bill. Thank Deputy Murray Farrell for bringing this forward, and I want to thank the students and the student representatives who've worked on this bill and have been campaigning on this from the different students' unions and colleges and from the Union of Students in Ireland, Aintus, Namakline, Erin. And firstly, just want to take issue really with the Minister's response and the core statement that the Minister put forward there, basically arguing against regulation on the basis that regulation, any attempt to regulate, could have a negative impact on supply. So you make that assertion, Minister, and then you didn't give any evidence to back it up. None. Now, you could say that about any form of regulation. Don't regulate anything in any sector because it could have an impact on supply. But the government doesn't put that forward in any other area. So why is it that the government thinks when it comes to students and their lived experience renting in rent-a-room accommodation, why is it that that is discounted? That their experience as human beings renting doesn't warrant regulation, but yet it's warranted in every other sphere, and for indeed every other form of renting. What is it that you think makes students immune from needing protections in law? Because you haven't said any of that. You've just said, oh, it could reduce supply, and just left it there, didn't give any evidence of that, nothing to back that up. You could apply that let's not regulate argument to any sector, but it wouldn't fly and it wouldn't wash. But somehow the government thinks it flies and it washes when it comes to students. And so think about that, and think about why you're effectively, as a government, willing to stand over continued mistreatment and discrimination against students compared to other sectors. Because that's what's happening. That's what's happening now. It's also a flawed argument to make just in terms of there's no evidence that regulation actually reduces supply. And I often reference this when we look at the private rent sector in general. The government say, and the Taoiseach said this to me recently, he said, well, if you regulate more for renters, put in better protections, it might reduce supply. Look internationally at the evidence, look at the most regulated countries in Europe for renters with the best protections, the best rent regulations. They're also the countries with the largest rental sectors. So this argument that if you regulate, it reduces supply, actually isn't borne out by evidence or facts on the ground. If you actually look at it, the most regulated places with the best rights for renters, also have the largest rental sectors, simply doesn't hold up. And of course, the question about whether or not we regulate in an area shouldn't just be, oh, it could reduce their impact on supply. The question about regulating should be, do we need regulation here? Is there injustices here? Does there need to be protections? And the case in terms of students and digs is overwhelmingly strong that there does need to be regulation in the area. If you read, and you didn't make any reference to it, but if you read the report by the Union of Students in Ireland in 2023, the USI National Survey on Student Digs, it gives some very important student experiences of what actually happens in the sector. And as others have said, there's mixed results, just some with very positive experiences. Just want to read from a couple here, Last Concordia. The first person says, I lived in digs when COVID broke out, and I feel the need to mention that the landlord was very kind and allowed me to keep my stuff during lockdown there without charging me rent, and even allowed me to stay the night when collecting my stuff that summer. Some people have great experiences. Another student said, avoid living in digs, they should be a last resort. Another said, digs landlord was not registered and took advantage of me and my housemates. They stole our food and upped our rent many times, and we had to comply. Having your food stolen from the person that you're renting from. Now you, the government, think, oh, we don't need to regulate this area. But this is a consequence of you not regulating, because that student had no rights, could be evicted straight away. And that is what has happened. There's been students who've had their stuff thrown out without any notice, put in black bags, put out in the front garden or out in the street. That's happened to students. I've spoken to students where that's happened. And you think this area doesn't need regulation? Let's consider it. Let's not rush into anything here when there's been these problems going on for years. Another student says, no protections, I lost out on my rent and deposit and could not source alternative accommodation. I was forced to commute 3 hours daily. And this is what happens if people lose out on their rent, lose out on a deposit paid. They may not be able to have the financial means to source anything else. This student was forced into very long commutes. Other students are forced into dropping out when that happens. And yet you think there isn't a case maybe here for regulation. Another student says, I felt I did not have privacy. When I left, the homeowners would come into my room and move things or tell me that I should move things. When I told them I did not feel comfortable with this, they dismissed me. And again, this is a student having their personal space interfered with, that they're renting for, they're paying money for it, with a subsidy from the state, because this is, just tax relief on this. And yet the government feel there's no urgency here in doing anything about regulating it. People's personal space being invaded. Now that impacts on, I don't need to tell you, Minister, students can be, they can be away from friends and family for the first time in their life. It can be quite a daunting experience for them. They don't necessarily have the same supports and networks that other people do. They don't always feel in a strong position to advocate for themselves. If they've got no rights and there's no regulation, they don't have any legal basis in which to advocate for themselves. They know if they do advocate for themselves, that they could be evicted. So when you say that there's we must be careful here not to do anything rash, and when you say we're afraid if we regulate, it might have an impact on supply, you have to address why you think it's okay to continue not to regulate and not provide basic protections for people who are handing over money for somewhere to live, that they should be afforded, same as anyone else who's handing over money to rent. And absolutely, the bill doesn't propose the same rights as people in the general private rent sector. It recognises that this is a different situation. I think that is appropriate. And of course, the other point as well, and it comes out from the USI National Survey, is of course that there's a lot of homeowners that would be supportive of this. The survey shows that most students renting in digs actually have written agreements with the homeowners. And of course, this is a good thing not just for the student, it's a good thing for the homeowner as well, to be able to have those rules and boundaries set out from the start, and having good communication around that. It benefits everyone. I do want to mention, just briefly in the time that's left, that there's, in terms of the wider issue around student accommodation, there's been the current Taoiseach, when he was the Minister that had responsibility in this area, made a lot of announcements about student accommodation, and we've had no shortage of announcements from this government in terms of student accommodation, but we have had a shortage of delivery, and there's been a real lack of action there. Just to give an example of 3 things that need to be done, that could be done quickly and should be done quickly. Firstly is the student accommodation strategy has to be published. That was due to be published in the summer of 2023. It must be sitting on the Minister's desk, but that needs to be published ASAP. Secondly, the borrowing framework for colleges needs to be put in place around student accommodation. So let's be clear about this. There's a number of colleges where the land is there, where the planning permissions are there, and where the need for student accommodation is most certainly there. But the borrowing framework to allow colleges to borrow to fund that investment is not in place and needs to be put in place. And we're not going to get the shovels in the ground that we need until the government put that borrowing framework in place. The other components are all there. And also there needs to be a sense of urgency from the government on this. For example, the proposal for 358 beds at Dartry from Trinity College is an example of a project that has stalled due to a lack of government support. And we're talking here about a site that was previously has housed students and has been sitting idle now for the last 4 years. There's an active proposal there from the college that would bring these 358 beds into use if the government would support it. So we have a housing crisis, a student accommodation crisis, active proposals, land in colleges with planning permissions, and yet due to government inaction and intransigence, not putting in place a borrowing framework, not giving funding for proposals like this, we're seeing the student accommodation crisis exacerbated when there's solutions, workable solutions, ready to go, but we're waiting on the government to act. So I just say to the Minister, we need urgency in terms of protecting students in vulnerable situations, and we need urgency in terms of delivering student accommodation. Gurv Malgat.